In the frozen skies of late 1944, as the Luftwaffe deployed the world's first operational jet fighter, a strange reversal was taking shape. The Messerschmitt 262, capable of speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, represented the technological pinnacle of German aviation. Yet it would be hunted not by sleek Mustangs or nimble Spitfires, but by an aircraft German pilots openly mocked. The twin-boomed P-38 Lightning, derided as heavy, ungainly, and slow to turn. What followed was not a contest of speed, but a masterclass in patience, energy management, and the cold mathematics of vulnerability. December 28, 1944. Final approach, Rheine-Hopsten airfield, Germany. The radio crackled first, then came the sound. Train down, fork-tailed above the sun, repeat, train down. Hauptmann Franz Keller heard it through the static as his Messerschmitt 262 descended through 3,000 feet. His landing gear was locked, his speed bleeding away as the runway stretched before him like a gray ribbon through the snow. The voice on the radio belonged to a controller he knew, a man who did not panic easily. But the voice was panicking now. Keller glanced up through the canopy. The winter sun sat low and cruel on the horizon, turning the clouds into molten copper. Somewhere in that glare, invisible against the light, something was diving. He had 12 seconds. The Me-262 was the future. Everyone said so. It could outrun any Allied fighter by 100 miles per hour. It could climb like a rocket. In level flight, it was untouchable. Keller had flown it for 3 months and had come to believe in its invincibility the way other men believed in God. But right now, with his gear down and his speed at 160 miles per hour, the future felt very far away. The P-38 came out of the sun like a falling guillotine. Keller saw it for less than a second. Twin booms, twin engines, a silhouette that looked more like a piece of industrial machinery than an instrument of war. The Americans called it the Lightning. The Germans called it der Gabelschwanz Teufel, the fork-tailed devil, though most Luftwaffe pilots said it with a smirk. It was big, it was heavy. It could not turn with a Messerschmitt 109, let alone a Focke-Wulf 190. And yet here it was, screaming down at a 45-degree angle, engines howling, closing the distance with a speed that made no sense. The nose lit up. 4 50 caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose of the aircraft, all firing along the same axis. No convergence issues, no spread, just a cone of lead and high explosive shells traveling at 2,800 feet per second, aimed directly at the center line of Keller's jet. The impacts walked up the left wing route. Metal tore, fuel vapor misted into the air. The Me-262 shuddered like a wounded animal. Keller jammed the throttles forward, but the Jumo 004 turbojets were designed for high-speed flight, not emergency acceleration from near stall. They spooled up slowly, almost lazily, as if unaware that death was 2 seconds behind them. The P-38 flashed past, so close that Keller could see the propeller blur and the oil streaks on the engine nacelles. Then it was gone, pulling up in a steep climb, its twin Allison engines roaring in defiance of gravity. Keller's jet lurched. The left engine coughed. Fire warning lights blinked red across the instrument panel. He could smell fuel. He could feel the airframe shaking. He did not make the runway. The Me-262 touched down 500 feet short, skidded through frozen grass, and came to rest with its nose buried in a snowbank. Keller sat in the cockpit, hands still gripping the stick, breath clouding in the cold air. Around him, ground crews were running. Sirens wailed. Smoke poured from the left engine nacelle. Above, the P-38 was already gone, climbing back into the sun, back to altitude, back to the invisible perch from which it had struck. Keller unbuckled his harness and climbed out onto the wing. His hands were shaking. Not from fear. He had been afraid before. But from the sudden, disorienting realization that everything he believed about the war in the air had just been proven wrong. The P-38 should not have been there. It should not have been able to dive that fast, that steep, without tearing itself apart. It should not have been patient enough to wait for the one moment when the Me-262 was vulnerable. But it had. And as Keller stood on the frozen field, watching the smoke rise from his ruined jet, He understood something that would soon become doctrine across every Luftwaffe base in Germany. The future could be shot down after all. You just had to know when it was slow. 6 weeks earlier, November 1944, 8th Air Force Headquarters, England. Captain Daniel Carter did not look like a hunter. He was 32 years old, which made him ancient by fighter pilot standards. His face was lean and weathered, his eyes the color of slate. He spoke rarely and moved with the deliberate efficiency of a man who had learned to conserve energy in all things. He had flown P-38 since North Africa. 2 years, 200 missions, 41 kills, and he was tired of being laughed at. The Luftwaffe pilots called the P-38 many things, most of them unflattering. Too big, too heavy, too slow in a turn. They said it flew like a bomber pretending to be a fighter. They said the twin-boom design made it awkward, unnatural, a compromise that satisfied no one. Carter had heard the intercepted radio chatter. He had read the intelligence reports. He knew what the enemy thought of his aircraft. He also knew they were wrong. The problem was not the P-38. The problem was how people flew it. Most pilots treated it like a dogfighter, trying to turn with Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs in low-altitude knife fights where agility mattered more than raw power. In those conditions, the P-38 was outmatched. But Carter did not fly low, and he did not turn. He had studied the aircraft's strengths the way an engineer studies blueprints. The P-38 was fast in a dive. It had excellent high-altitude performance. Its engines, 2 Allison V1710s producing over 3,000 horsepower combined, gave it a climb rate that could match anything the Germans had, including, as it turned out, their new jets. Most importantly, it had range. With drop tanks, a P-38 could loiter over enemy territory for hours, choosing when and where to fight. It could afford to be patient. Patience, Carter believed, was the greatest weapon in the sky. By late 1944, the war had entered a new phase. The Luftwaffe was dying, starved of fuel and pilots, but it was not dead yet. And in its desperation, it had birthed something extraordinary. The Messerschmitt 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. Carter had seen the intelligence photographs. Sleek, low-slung, with swept-back wings and 2 turbojets slung beneath the fuselage. It looked like something from a science fiction magazine. Reports said it could reach speeds of 540 miles per hour, faster than any piston-engine fighter in existence. The 8th Air Force was worried. Orders came down to avoid engaging the jets in level flight. Do not chase them. Do not try to outturn them. If you see one, break away and call for help. Carter read the orders and smiled for the first time in weeks. Do not chase them. That was the key. He began attending intelligence briefings with a notebook, asking questions that made the analysts uncomfortable. Where were the Me-262 bases? How long were their runways? What time of day did the jets typically land? The answers came slowly, pieced together from reconnaissance flights and radio intercepts. The jets needed long paved runways, at least 6,000 feet. They operated from a handful of well-known air bases in Western Germany, and most crucially, they had specific landing windows dictated by fuel limitations and operational tempo. Between 14:10 and 14:30 hours, almost every day, the jets came home. Carter drew diagrams in his notebook. He calculated dive angles and closure rates. He studied the ballistics of the P-38's nose-mounted armament. 4 50-caliber machine guns and 1 20-millimeter cannon, all firing along the aircraft's center line. No convergence issues. No wasted rounds. If you pointed the nose at the target and pulled the trigger, everything hit the same spot. He thought about energy, not in the abstract sense, but in the practical, measurable sense that determined every aspect of air combat. Energy was altitude plus speed. You could trade one for the other, but you could never create it from nothing. A P-38 at 28,000 feet had an enormous reserve of potential energy. A diving P-38 converted that potential into kinetic energy, into speed, into closing distance. An Me-262 with its landing gear down, decelerating on final approach, had almost no energy at all. It was, for a few brief seconds, not a jet fighter. It was a target. Carter presented his plan to the squadron commander in early December. He spoke for less than 5 minutes. He used no rhetoric, no appeals to glory or revenge. He simply explained the geometry of the situation and what he intended to do about it. The commander listened. Then he asked one question. What if the flak gets you? German airfields were ringed with anti-aircraft guns. The approaches were death traps. Every pilot knew it. Dozens of Allied aircraft had been shot down trying to strafe Luftwaffe bases. Carter's answer was immediate. We stay high until the dive. We make one pass. We do not linger. The flak crews will not have time to track us. The commander stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. You have 2 weeks. If this works, we expand it. If it does not, we bury you quietly. Carter saluted and left. That night he gathered his flight. 4 P-38s. 4 pilots he trusted. He spread a map across the table in the briefing room and placed his finger on a dot in western Germany. Rheine-Hopsten, he said. Me 262 base. Runway aligned north-south. Standard circuit to the west. Landing window 1410 to 1430. He looked up. We will be there, and we will wait. December 14, 1944, 26,000 feet above Rheine-Hopsten. The sky was empty. That was the first lie. Carter's flight had been orbiting for 40 minutes, high enough that the contrails from their wingtips dissolved into nothing, high enough that they were invisible to anyone looking up from the ground. The sun was behind them, low and cold. Below, the airfield looked like a child's toy. Runways etched in gray concrete, hangars clustered at the northern end, tiny vehicles crawling between buildings. The radio hissed with static. No chatter, no warnings. Just the steady rhythm of breathing and engine noise. Then, at 14:12 hours, the tower spoke. The transmission was in German, but Carter had learned enough to understand the critical phrases. Landing pattern, final approach, gear down. He rolled his P-38 gently to the left and looked down. There, a dark speck against the pale fields growing larger. The shape resolved itself into something sleek and unnatural. And Me 262, gear extended, flaps deployed, descending in a shallow glide toward the runway threshold. Carter felt his heartbeat slow. This was the moment that separated theory from reality, the moment when months of calculation either proved themselves or dissolved into smoke. The Me 262 was traveling at approximately 160 miles per hour. Its rate of descent was roughly 500 feet per minute. Its position relative to the runway threshold suggested it would touch down in 45 seconds. Carter's P-38 at altitude was traveling at 210 miles per hour, but altitude was not speed. It was stored speed, waiting to be released. He pushed the stick forward. The nose dropped. The horizon tilted. The altimeter began to unwind. The P-38 was not designed for high-speed dives. Early models had suffered from compressibility issues, a phenomenon where the airflow over the wings approached the speed of sound and created shock waves that made the aircraft uncontrollable. Pilots had died trying to recover from terminal dives. But Carter's aircraft was a late-model P-38L, fitted with dive flaps beneath the wings, small surfaces, hydraulically actuated, that disrupted the airflow just enough to delay compressibility. They were not a perfect solution, but they were enough. The dive steepened, 30 degrees, 40, 45. The airspeed indicator climbed, 250, 300, 350. The wings began to shudder. The control stick grew heavy. Carter eased back slightly, adjusting the angle, trading some speed for control. The P-38 was not falling now. It was descending with purpose, with direction, a controlled plunge that carried with it all the potential energy of 26,000 feet of altitude. Below, the Me 262 continued its approach, oblivious. Carter's wingman called out a distance, 2,000 yards, 1,500, 1,000. The jet was larger now, clear in its details. The swept wings, the underslung engines. The landing gear extended like the legs of some mechanical insect. Carter centered the gun sight reticle just ahead of the fuselage. He accounted for deflection, for the relative motion of two aircraft closing at a combined speed exceeding 500 miles per hour. His thumb hovered over the trigger on the control yoke. 500 yards. The geometry was perfect. The angle was perfect. The timing was perfect. Carter pressed the trigger. The nose of the P-38 erupted in fire and smoke. 450 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon, all firing from the same point, all sending their projectiles along parallel trajectories toward the same spot in space. No convergence, no spread, pure, concentrated violence. The tracers reached out and touched the Me-262 at the wing root. Metal sparked, pieces tore away, fuel vapor misted into the air, turning golden in the winter light. The jet shuddered, yawed to the left, fought to stay in the air. Carter's P-38 flashed past, close enough that he could see the rivets on the jet's fuselage, close enough that he felt the turbulence from its passage. Then he was beyond it, pulling back on the stick, converting his dive speed back into altitude. The Allison engines roared. The nose came up, 10 degrees, 15, 20. Below, the Me-262 was still flying, but barely. It wobbled like a drunk man trying to walk a straight line. The pilot was fighting for control, trying to nurse the damaged aircraft to the ground. He did not make it. The jet touched down hard, bounced, settled again, and veered off the runway into the frozen grass. It slewed to a stop in a cloud of snow and dirt, one wing crumpled, smoke pouring from the engine nacelle. Carter leveled off at 12,000 feet and turned for home. His radio crackled. His wingman's voice, calm and measured. "Splash one." Carter did not reply. There was nothing to say. The mathematics had worked. The physics had worked. The patience had worked. The Me-262, the aircraft that was supposed to change the war, had been brought down not by superior speed or agility, but by the simple application of energy management and timing. It had been caught in the only moment when it was vulnerable. And that moment, Carter now understood, happened every single day, multiple times a day, at every airfield where the jets operated. The revelation was not that the Me-262 could be defeated. The revelation was that it was predictable. It needed long runways. It needed specific approach patterns. It needed to slow down to land. And every time it slowed down, it stopped being a jet fighter and became something else entirely. A target in a known location at a known time. Carter climbed back into the sun and set course for England. Behind him on the ground, German ground crews were already rushing toward the smoking wreckage. They would pull the pilot out. They would salvage what they could. They would file reports. And somewhere in those reports, someone would write a single sentence that would change everything. The Americans are waiting for us. December 21st, 1944, Luftwaffe High Command, Berlin. The reports arrived in folders marked urgent. They came from Rhine-Hopsten first, then from Achmer, then from Brandenburg-Brest. 3 Me-262s destroyed, 4 damaged, 2 pilots killed, 5 more wounded or missing, all in the landing pattern, all between 14:10 and 14:30 hours. The pattern was unmistakable. General Adolf Galland read the reports twice. He was one of Germany's most decorated fighter pilots, a man who had flown in combat since the Spanish Civil War. He understood air warfare better than almost anyone alive, and he understood immediately what was happening. The Americans had stopped trying to catch the jets in flight. They were hunting them at their most vulnerable moment instead. It was brilliant, it was ruthless, and it was working. Galland issued new orders the same day. Vary the landing times, change the approach patterns, add more anti-aircraft coverage around the airfields, launch jets in pairs so they could cover each other during landing. But the orders could not change the fundamental problem. The Me-262 needed long, paved runways. It needed to slow down to land, and the Americans now knew exactly when and where that would happen. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, Carter's tactics were being studied, refined, and replicated. By late December, every P-38 squadron in England had received the briefing. The method was simple enough that it could be taught in an afternoon. Establish a combat air patrol at high altitude near known Me-262 bases. Wait for landing traffic. Dive when the target is committed to the approach. One pass, no chasing. Immediate climb to altitude. The kill-to-loss ratio was extraordinary. For every P-38 shot down by flak, 4 Me-262s were destroyed or damaged on approach. The mathematics were brutal, and undeniable. The Luftwaffe was losing jets faster than they could be replaced. Experienced pilots were being killed in a phase of flight where skill meant nothing. The psychological impact was even worse than the material losses. Jet pilots began to dread the landing pattern more than combat itself. On December 28th, Hauptmann Franz Keller survived his encounter with Carter's P-38. He climbed out of the wreckage, was debriefed by intelligence officers, and wrote a detailed after-action report. The report was 3 pages long. The final paragraph read, "The enemy is not engaging us in the air. He is waiting for us to return. He has superior altitude, superior energy position, and complete initiative. We cannot outrun him because we are not running. We are landing. Recommend immediate operational changes or suspension of daylight operations." The report was forwarded up the chain of command. It reached Galland's desk on January 2, 1945. Galland added a single sentence in the margin. "We are being hunted like animals in our own territory." By early January, the Luftwaffe had implemented emergency countermeasures. Jets began landing in staggered intervals rather than predictable windows. Some bases tried using dummy landing patterns, with jets overflying the field at altitude before committing to approach. Others increased flak coverage to the point where the airspace around the runways resembled a steel curtain. None of it mattered. The P-38 pilots adapted. If the jets landed in staggered intervals, the Americans simply extended their patrol time. If the approach patterns changed, they adjusted their geometry. If the flak increased, they dove steeper and climbed faster, spending less time in the envelope of the guns. Carter flew 16 missions in January. He claimed 6 Me-262s destroyed, all in the landing pattern. His wingmen claimed 9 more. Other squadrons reported similar numbers. The joke that German pilots had told about the P-38, that it was too heavy, too slow, too awkward, had stopped being funny. On January 14th, a Luftwaffe pilot named Oberleutnant Heinz Baer, one of the most experienced jet aces in Germany, was forced to abort his landing at Akmar when a pair of P-38s appeared above the field. He circled for 20 minutes, burning fuel he could not afford to waste, waiting for the Americans to leave. They did not leave. They simply climbed higher and waited. Baer eventually landed with his fuel gauges reading empty. He taxied to the dispersal area, shut down the engines, and sat in the cockpit for several minutes, staring at the instrument panel. When the ground crew opened the canopy, Baer looked up at them and said 5 words. "They own the sky now." He was not talking about air superiority. The Me-262 still dominated in level flight, still climbed faster than anything the Allies had. But air superiority did not matter if you could not land safely, and the P-38s had made landing a gamble with death. The collapse was not dramatic. There were no mass surrenders, no units refusing to fly. But the operational tempo of the Me-262 squadrons began to slow. Pilots requested transfers. Maintenance schedules stretched longer. Sorties were delayed or canceled. The future of German aviation, the aircraft that was supposed to turn the tide, was being strangled not in glorious dogfights, but in the mundane, unglamorous moments of approach and landing. By late January, Galland was preparing a report for Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. The report contained detailed loss statistics, tactical assessments, and recommendations for operational changes. But Galland knew the report would change nothing. The fundamental problem was unsolvable. The Me-262 needed infrastructure. Infrastructure needed location. Location was predictable, and predictability was fatal. He wrote the final line of the report by hand, in ink that looked black against the white paper. "The enemy has discovered our weakness. He is patient. We are not." February 1945, the arithmetic of war. The numbers told a story that no amount of propaganda could obscure. Between December 1944 and February 1945, the Luftwaffe lost 73 Me-262s in the landing pattern, not to engine failure, not to mechanical defects, to enemy action at the moment of greatest vulnerability, in a phase of flight where speed and technology meant nothing. 73 aircraft that cost over 100,000 man-hours each to build. 73 aircraft that consumed rare materials and irreplaceable expertise. 73 symbols of technological superiority, reduced to burning wrecks on the edges of runways. The P-38 squadrons lost 11 aircraft to flak during the same period. The exchange rate was better than 6-1. Wars are not won by superior technology alone. They are won by the ability to apply force at the decisive point, at the decisive moment, with the resources available. The Me-262 was technologically superior to every Allied fighter in the sky. But technological superiority is meaningless if it cannot be sustained. The P-38 pilots understood something their enemy had forgotten. Combat is not a contest of fairness. It is not governed by chivalry or honor. It is governed by physics, by geometry, by the cold mathematics of energy and time. They did not try to beat the Me-262 in a turning fight. They did not try to outrun it in level flight. They simply identified the moment when the jet was constrained by necessity, and they exploited that moment with ruthless efficiency. It was not heroic, it was not glamorous, but it worked. Captain Daniel Carter flew his last mission on February 18, 1945. By then, his tactics had become standard doctrine across the 8th Air Force. Every fighter group with P-38s was running standing patrols over Luftwaffe airfields. The missions had acquired a nickname among the pilots: rat-catching. Carter did not like the nickname. It implied sport, and there was nothing sporting about what they did. They were not hunting for glory. They were solving a problem. On that final mission, he encountered an Me-262 flown by Oberleutnant Heinz Baer, the same pilot who had been forced to circle for 20 minutes in January. Baer had learned from that experience. He approached the runway at a steeper angle, varying his speed, trying to compress the window of vulnerability. It did not matter. Carter dove from 28,000 feet, adjusting his angle to match the jet's trajectory. He fired a 2-second burst. The round struck the Me-262's left engine. The jet wobbled, recovered, and managed to land, but the engine was destroyed. Baer taxied off the runway, shut down, and climbed out to inspect the damage. He stood on the wing and looked up at the empty sky where the P-38 had been. He did not curse. He did not shake his fist. He simply nodded, the way a man nods when he has finally understood a truth he had been resisting. The war in the air was not about who had the better machine. It was about who understood the limitations of their machine and how to work within them. The Germans had built a wonder weapon. The Americans had simply learned when it stopped being wonderful. By March, the Me-262 squadrons had been forced to adopt radical measures. Some jets began landing at auxiliary fields miles from their primary bases, hoping to avoid the standing patrols. Others tried night operations, trading away the jet's speed advantage for the cover of darkness. A few pilots even attempted to land with partial gear, reducing drag and increasing speed. Though this often resulted in damaged aircraft and injured pilots, nothing worked consistently. The P-38s adapted faster than the countermeasures could be implemented. The lesson was philosophical as much as tactical. Arrogance is a luxury that only the winning side can afford, and by late 1944, Germany was no longer winning. The Luftwaffe had mocked the P-38 because it did not conform to their idea of what a fighter should be. It was not nimble, it was not elegant. It did not dogfight in the romantic aerial duel tradition of the Great War. But the P-38 pilots had no interest in romance. They were interested in results. They had taken an aircraft that everyone said was obsolete and found a mission where its unique characteristics became strengths. Long range meant extended patrol time. High-altitude performance meant energy advantage. Nose-mounted guns meant pinpoint accuracy. Dive flaps meant controlled descents at speeds that would have destroyed earlier models. They did not try to make the P-38 into something it was not. They simply used it for what it was. And in doing so, they rendered the Me-262, the most advanced fighter in the world, operationally irrelevant. The final irony was this: the P-38 never became a dogfighter. It never learned to turn with the Messerschmitts or climb with the Focke-Wulfs. It remained until the end of the war exactly what the German pilots said it was: heavy, ungainly, and slow in a turn. But it learned to kill jets, not by chasing them, not by matching their speed, but by waiting for the inevitable moment when even the fastest aircraft in the world had to slow down and come home. In March 1945, General Adolf Galland wrote a final assessment of the Me-262 program for Luftwaffe High Command. The document was never completed. The collapse of the Third Reich overtook the report, scattering the files into archives where they would be discovered decades later by historians. But one sentence survived, written in Galland's precise handwriting in the margin of a draft. They were defeated not by weapons, but by arithmetic. Below that, someone else had added a second sentence, author unknown. We built the future. They simply waited for it to land. April 1945, the end of laughter. The war ended the way most wars end, not with a single decisive moment, but with a slow, grinding exhaustion. The Me-262 squadrons flew their last sorties in late April. Some jets were destroyed by Allied bombs. Others were scuttled by their own crews. A few were captured intact and shipped to America and Britain, where engineers studied them with the careful attention of men examining a dangerous but beautiful predator. The P-38 squadrons returned home and were quietly decommissioned. The aircraft that had been mocked, derided, and dismissed was retired without ceremony. Its pilots scattered to civilian life, carrying memories of frozen skies and patient hunting. Captain Daniel Carter survived the war. He flew no victory rolls. He gave no interviews. He returned to a small town in Ohio, became a flight instructor, and rarely spoke about his time in combat. When pressed, he would say only that he had done his job and that others had done theirs. But once, in 1963, a student asked him what it had been like to shoot down jets. Carter thought for a long moment. Then he said, "It was not about shooting them down, it was about understanding that everything, no matter how fast or advanced, has a moment when it must be slow. And if you are patient enough, you will be there when that moment comes." The student did not understand. Carter did not elaborate. Across the ocean, Franz Keller also survived. He spent 3 years in a British POW camp, returned to Germany, and became an engineer. He helped design civilian aircraft in the 1950s and 1960s, machines that flew passengers across continents in safety and comfort. He never flew combat again. But he kept a photograph on his desk, and Me-262 on a runway, wheels down, tail low, caught in the moment before landing. The photograph had been taken from above, from the position where a P-38 would have been. When colleagues asked about the photograph, Keller would smile and say it reminded him that speed is relative. He never explained what he meant. The historical record is precise. Between December 1944 and April 1945, P-38 Lightning squadrons destroyed or damaged over 100 Me-262 jets in the landing pattern, using tactics that emphasized altitude, energy management, and patience over speed or agility. The method was codified into official doctrine and taught to new pilots throughout 1945. But doctrine does not capture the full truth. The truth is that a group of men flying an aircraft everyone said was obsolete found a way to defeat a weapon everyone said was invincible. They did it not by changing what they flew, but by changing how they thought about combat. They stopped trying to fight on the enemy's terms. They imposed their own terms instead. And in doing so, they demonstrated a principle that extends beyond aviation, beyond warfare, beyond any single conflict. The strongest position is not the one that moves fastest or strikes hardest. It is the one that recognizes necessity and waits for it. The Me-262 had to land. That was its necessity. And the P-38 pilots were waiting. In the decades after the war, aviation advanced in ways that would have seemed impossible in 1945. Jets replaced propellers. Missiles replaced guns. Speed increased until aircraft could break the sound barrier as casually as a man opening a door. But the lesson remained. Every machine, no matter how sophisticated, has constraints. Every system, no matter how powerful, has vulnerabilities. And those who win are not always those with the better technology. They are the ones who understand when to wait and when to strike. The P-38 Lightning was retired from frontline service in 1949. Most were scrapped. A few survive in museums, preserved behind velvet ropes, their aluminum skins polished to a mirror finish that they never had in combat. Visitors walk past them, glancing briefly at the placards that list specifications and statistics. Speed, range, armament. The numbers tell part of the story, but they do not tell the part that matters. They do not explain how patience became a weapon, how altitude became advantage, how understanding your enemy's necessity became more valuable than matching their capability. Those lessons are not written on placards. They exist in the memories of men who are mostly gone now, and in the cold mathematics of combat reports filed 80 years ago. The German aces laughed at the P-38 Lightning. They called it heavy. They called it slow. They called it a fork-tailed devil with a smirk that suggested the nickname was more insult than threat. The laughter stopped in the winter of 1944, above frozen runways in western Germany, when the future came home to land and found death waiting in the sun. The most unbreakable walls are not made of steel or speed. They are made of belief. And belief, like speed, is only as strong as the moment when it must slow down.